Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Rain Checks Strengthening Stormwater Rules for Climate Resilient Communities. My name is Ariana Proya, and I am the community organizer here at the Charles River Watershed Association. And we're thrilled to have you all with us today. As communities throughout the region face increasing challenges from more intense storms, flooding, and aging infrastructure, strengthening our local stormwater policies have never been more important. Today, we'll be sharing findings and recommendations developed in partnership with the UNH Stormwater Center, focusing on how tiered and practical updates to stormwater regulations can reduce flooding, reduce flood risk, improve water quality, and support climate resilience. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping things. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available after, along with the slides and a few other documents that we'll be talking about later. Please feel free to drop the Q&A in the chat at any time, but we will be having a dedicated Q&A at the end. So if you don't want to lose track of your questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will go over those later. And then if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you can use the chat to message our team. Carly, who is on the team on the Zoom with us today, is running our Zoom. So thank you. Next slide. So today you'll hear from myself, our senior stormwater program manager, Max Rome, and our Rita Barron fellow, Alfredo Khan. This has been the team who's been working on this project for probably about the last 6-7 months. So we're really excited to share some of our findings with you today. Next slide. As we talk about our watershed, I do want to take a moment for a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Charles River Watershed resides on occupied territory of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag tribes. We acknowledge that a land acknowledgement is not enough, and we continue to learn, grow, and listen to Native voices as we advocate for a resilient future. Next slide. I know most of you know our watershed, but as I just want to give a kind of brief background. So this is an 80-mile long river that runs throughout the whole watershed. We have about 35 cities and towns in our watershed, and we kind of help all of them. And we have about 1 million plus residents in this watershed, as well as about 60% of the residents in environmental justice neighborhoods, which are primarily in our lower watershed. So that helps kind of set the scene of what we looked at. It's a very large watershed, and we try to tackle a lot of different aspects in that. Next slide. Before we kind of get into kind of the background of the project, I did want to give a brief overview of our recommendations that we're going to be talking about today. CRWA, in partnership with the UNH Stormwater Center, developed these. This is a system designed to treat new development and redevelopment projects equally. And as we provide clarity and fairness of how stormwater regulations are applied, this is a really interesting way we developed it. We looked at minor permits, extensive retrofit permits, and major permits, and we defined these as 3 different ways with applicability and retention standard. For minor permits, we look at new impervious surface between 400 and 100,000 square feet, or disturbances over 5,000 square feet. And we recommend that they are required to retain 2 inches of runoff multiplied by new impervious surface. For extensive retrofit permits, which is a really interesting way that I'll just preface that to capture kind of projects that you might not traditionally capture, like parking lot milling or substantial retrofits, where the retrofit is equal to 30% of property value. And we recommend that for that type of permit, you would retain 2 inches multiplied by 20% of pre-existing impervious area, or alternatively achieve a 20% reduction in impervious surface. And then for major projects, which is something that we'll really kind of dive into later, we will look at projects that are having new impervious area of greater than 1,000 square feet, or land disturbances of greater than 5,000 square feet. And we recommend that they require the 100-year storm retention as defined by the NOAA Atlas 14 times the total impervious area. With that said, I'm going to move to the next slide and turn it over to Max Rome.
Thank you so much, Ari. And, I know we've got, a mix of people in this Zoom room with us today. So I'm going to try and kind of give hopefully an interesting and not too redundant kind of background and motivation to this work. What do we all need to understand about water quality progress in the Charles River, the current regulations, and then I want to share kind of some of what CRWA has been understanding as the shortcomings or the challenges of our current regulations. Next slide. So I love to just start with where we're coming from. This picture of the disappointed swimmers on Magazine Beach in 1948 is, just a really iconic image of, what we've lost and what we're trying to regain in the Charles River. In 1947, there were 8 public swimming beaches in the lower basin. In 1948, those were closed. 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed and established a goal of fishable and swimmable rivers and lakes and waters in the United States. So, the goal of having a swimmable Charles River, it's not just a kind of good idea. It's not just kind of an out there concept. It's the law. And, today we've made a ton of progress between, 1995 and 2005. The river went from getting a D, basically never meeting swimming standards, to getting somewhere between a B plus and A minus most years. And in recent years, we've been able to, this in Boston and Cambridge, we've been able to hold public swimming events, with special permission. Next slide. What I just described is mostly a story about making progress with bacterial contamination, controlling the amount of sewage that's coming into the river. What that doesn't really touch is what's happening with toxic algal blooms in the Charles. Some of you who were in the lower basin this last summer, may have noticed that the river turned really bright green, and it stayed bright green for a pretty long time. The river regularly experiences potentially toxic blooms of cyanobacteria. This is one of the very major obstacles to getting back to having a river that's safe for swimming and kind of primary contact recreation. Next slide. And we have a really substantial regulatory framework for tackling this eutrophication, for tackling this excess growth of algae. So, in 2007, the Charles River, the lower basin, in 2007, the upper basin in 2011, got total maximum daily load. So for any of you who don't know this acronym already, TMDLs are kind of like a diet that the river gets put on. We look at all of it. It's a modeling and a source pollution study that was done, basically by the EPA and Mass DEP, and it says, okay, where's the excess phosphorus coming from? What would be an amount of phosphorus that could enter this river, and the river could process in a healthy way without producing algal blooms? And then finally, what's the reduction that needs to be achieved in each watershed community, in each of the 35 communities through the Charles River? Next slide. Yeah. Want to go back one more to the one with the curve on it. Yes, thank you. So 2007 is when we got the TMDL, and it wasn't until 2018 that TMDL really became implemented in our state stormwater regulations, which are called the MS4 general permit. And these state regulations do a lot of things. They're basically the context for the conversation we're trying to have today. But one of the things they do is they set out kind of a 20-year planning and implementation cycle that all of the towns in the watershed are walking through, with a goal of getting to about a 53% reduction in nutrient loading by the year 2038. And just, a comment, we just finished this first planning phase, which is called, producing the phase 1 phosphorus control plans. that just wrapped up in 2023. So we're kind of at the end of the beginning with respect to implementing these stormwater reductions. Next slide. From our perspective, the stormwater permit has a couple really critically important requirements. The one we're really focusing on now is about the post-construction requirements. As part of this permit, the permittees are required to develop or modify an ordinance or regulation that's at least as stringent as what follows what's quoted on this text. Basically, for new sites that are larger than 1 acre, that disturb more than 1 acre, those sites either need to remove 60% of the total phosphorus loading or retain the equivalent of 1 inch times the impervious area on the site. Similarly, for redevelopment, it's a slightly less stringent standard, 50% phosphorus removal or retain 0.8 of an inch over the entire site. And this is typically done using, rain gardens or infiltration systems. Often these are vegetated systems that can really add some aesthetic value, add some habitat value, do some greening and cooling within the city. Next slide. So I'm going to kind of briefly introduce some of the challenges with this regulatory framework. So the first one is that, we talked about 60% phosphorus removal or 1 inch retention. There's a challenge because the retention standard is not equivalent to the phosphorus reduction standard. And this is a curve from attachment 3 to appendix F of the MS4 permit. If you don't love reading these curves, I'll just kind of give you the punchline, which is that, for kind of a typical green infrastructure practice, an infiltration trench on kind of decent soils, if we are retaining the first inch of water, we expect to remove 94-95% of the phosphorus that's falling on that site. So, first inch, 94-95% removal. If we're looking at 60% removal, it's a lot less than 90%. That's equivalent to about retaining the first quarter inch on site. So, one challenge that we have right here is that there are 2 different standards within the MS4 permit. One of them is very strong, and one of them is not as strong. Next slide. Kind of a second and more fundamental challenge in the MS4 permit is that it allows additional loading. This is a permit that's designed to protect our watershed, designed to protect lakes and ponds, but it doesn't really do that. It just makes new development less harmful. It doesn't make it not harmful. And similarly with redevelopment, it in many cases can reduce the loading associated with redevelopment, but it doesn't require kind of correction back to a natural state that's going to really achieve our clean water goals. And this is just a little example. If you add an acre of impervious area and mitigate 60% of that load, you're still going to end up with additional loading into the river. Next slide. Finally, a big challenge with the MS4 permit is it only regulates projects that are greater than 1 acre. And, from EPA's watershed analysis, from kind of a lot of different parcel-based analysis, this graph comes from the RDA permit, or from the property parcel analysis that's part of the RDA permit. But what you can see is about, even for commercial, institutional, and industrial properties, about 50% of the phosphorus loading in our watershed comes from sites that are smaller than 1 acre. And when we have a permit system that's only focused on larger properties, we're missing the opportunity to mitigate nutrient loading from these smaller sites. And we're missing a lot of opportunities to do that. Next slide. So I mentioned that we just kind of completed the first phase of phosphorus control planning, and I want to share kind of a couple takeaways from CRWA's review of those phosphorus control plans. This plot kind of shows the debit and credit of what's happened with phosphorus loading. In purple, we see additional nutrient loading that's kind of came from changes in land use, so new development, new hardscape. And on the left in teal, you can see what portion of that new development has been mitigated through implementation of BMPs that towns are tracking across the watershed. And the real takeaway here is that within our watershed, changes in land use have resulted in about a 5% increase in phosphorus loading, but municipally tracked BMP implementation has not kept up with that additional loading. And remember, our goal is to achieve a 50% reduction compared to kind of 2005 loading. And what we're seeing is that we are not even keeping up with additional loading within our watershed. And this is on a watershed scale. This isn't specific to any town. The picture is different in every different town in our watershed. Next slide. So, I hope that kind of discussion can help ground us all in, in thinking about the work that needs to be done. And I'm going to give us a bit of like a clickbaity title for this next section. Can strengthening local regulations protect the river, save money, and mitigate climate change? I hope that prompt is interesting to folks, and we're going to make the argument that it can, and it's a good way to achieve these goals. Next slide. So just to kind of reiterate and hit these points home, meeting required phosphorus reductions through public retrofits, through big public projects is really expensive and it's really hard. What we saw through our phosphorus control plan review is that new development is increasing nutrient loads and the existing regulations do not keep up. They're not keeping up with new development. And then finally, something that we know in our watershed and that we know from speaking with many of you is that the existing storm drain networks, in many cases, were designed for, a historical 10-year storm, and they may be too small for some of the larger storms that we're experiencing now. They're not designed for increases in precipitation. They're not necessarily designed to keep up with all the new development, and they're certainly not designed to mitigate climate-related flooding. Next slide. I'm going to go through each of these points kind of quickly. The first is about cost. CRWA did some work a few years ago that found to deal with 1 pound of phosphorus through a public retrofit. The median cost for that was about $100,000 per pound of phosphorus. And these are some numbers that we're able to pull from the phosphorus control plans. They're a little bit lower than that number, which is great. And two things that really stand out are how efficient non-structural practices are, so street sweeping, catch basin cleanings, and then importantly, what it really costs a town to track and certify stormwater BMPs on private property. So there were a number of towns that did excellent jobs of really tracking staff hours related to doing these certification of private BMPs. And what we saw in our watershed is that there are over 800 pounds of phosphorus reduction from private BMPs, and that on average the median cost to kind of claim each of these credits is about $2,000 per pound phosphorus removal. So I think if you're a stormwater manager in your town, that's a big number. That's huge savings. That's a potentially viable pathway to meet these reduction targets. Next slide. Another point on this, when we look back at where BMPs have been implemented, to date, most of the BMPs in our watershed are on private property, But as towns are planning for the future, they're really focused on public property. So we'd really, a goal with this project is to kind of equip towns to do better with with harnessing development to achieve nutrient reduction on private property. Next slide. Something that we've mentioned but not really talked a lot about is what's happening with climate change. This is a slide that we use a lot in CRWA's climate compact. And the punchline here is, yeah, we're expecting more rain in the future and we're expecting more intense storms. The present day 25-year storm is comparable to a 10-year storm by 2050. So storms are getting, heavy storms are getting much more frequent, so that 10-year planning horizon is going to need to accommodate a much more extreme rainfall event. Next slide. And through the climate compact, through the flood model, we've looked at a range of different scenarios to figure out what can we do within our watershed to make sure that the future 10-year storm is not causing way more flooding than the current day 10-year storm. And one of the solutions that has really risen to the surface is looking at something similar to the Watertown rule. Watertown, as we've kind of teased throughout this presentation, has a requirement to retain and infiltrate the 100-year storm on site for many projects. And the Charles River flood model was able to kind of model what future flooding would look like if that rule was applied across our watershed. And in green, you can actually see parts of the watershed that would have less future flooding than they do today if that rule were applied and rolled out kind of coincident with new development and redevelopment. Next slide. So I'm going to turn this back over to Ari, who's going to kind of give you some of the specifics of the work that we did with UNH and what we found.
Thank you, Max. So like Max just said, I'm going to kind of dig a little deeper into how we kind of got to the recommendations that we talked about a little bit earlier and that we'll talk about later. Carly, can you move to the next slide? So with what we just talked about, we, the Charles River Watershed communities are navigating two urgent and interconnected challenges, which is meeting these strict TMDL nutrient reduction goals, but also addressing increasing flood risk fueled by climate change. One of the most impactful and cost-effective tools at the disposal of municipalities is a proactive stormwater regulation. When designed with intention, local regulations can harness private development to advance public goals like improving water quality, building infrastructure resilience, and reducing flood impacts. So to support this approach that we've been talking about, CRWA partnered with UNH at their Stormwater Center to conduct a comprehensive review of the stormwater bylaws and regulations across 33 municipalities in the watershed. So as a part of this project, our team took the time to locate and thoroughly review each of these regulations for each municipality within the watershed. This process allowed us to have a better understanding of the diverse landscape, not only in terms of urbanization, but also in terms of how communities across the watershed are already taking an innovative approach to managing stormwater. So you can see a screenshot of our matrix on this slide right now. This matrix will be made public today after this webinar. So it's going to show you kind of the town, where we find these most stringent regulations are located, applicability, performance standards, if they fall into a tiered system already. And we also looked at impervious surface area that a town currently has. Next slide. Our analysis of this matrix that we put together focused on three things. So applicability, so that's when and where stormwater requirements are triggered. retention standards, so how much stormwater must be retained on site. And these are usually held in these post-construction management plans. And then regulatory housing, so where the most stringent requirements are located. So sometimes we're finding them in a zoning bylaw, sometimes we're finding them in a standalone stormwater ordinance. It really ranges based on kind of town government systems. And it was a little confusing, so it was a really good way to kind of organize them in a way that will be not helpful for us, but also for yourselves. So from this work, we developed a set of recommendations based in applied practices aimed at establishing a climate mitigation standard for the region. These recommendations not only go beyond the current state requirement, but they also prioritize cost savings, particularly for municipalities. It's important to highlight municipal regulations kind of in our review emerged as a low-hanging fruit. So this is like a strategic entry point for action. So targeted updates to existing bylaws and ordinances can yield significant returns. These regulatory changes are smart, scalable way to ensure development contributes to long-term stormwater solutions without requiring major public investments up front, which we, as someone who works a lot with our municipalities in our watershed, kind of the cost of doing a lot of these things in the current climate we're in has been a topic that I hear a lot from. So we wanted to keep that in mind. By making smart regulatory changes, now municipalities can build a more climate resilient future at a lower cost and with broader stakeholder support. Next slide. So I wanted to kind of highlight the unequal approaches and kind of the spectrum we see in our watershed. So these are 3 towns in our lower basin: the city of Cambridge, the city of Newton, and the city of Watertown. And they really range in how they have their stormwater regulations implemented. As Max has mentioned, Watertown, for any project, must provide retention of that 100-year storm on site, which has kind of been the gold standard that we've really talked about in our watershed. The city of Newton does a good example of showing a tiered permit system. They do a minor and major permit, and they have a pretty big range on kind of what projects fall into that. And then the city of Cambridge also takes a kind of a different approach by including parking spaces in their kind of applicability, but they do tend to stay within the state standard of phosphorus loading by 65, reducing phosphorus loading by 65%. So we're seeing in these kind of more urbanized areas, there's a really unique way in each area that are taking this approach. So I just did want to highlight that, kind of some of the things you'll see in the matrix. Next slide. So we're going to dive back into the recommendations and kind of talk a little bit more about those. Next slide. So as we talked about earlier, just to kind of review, because I know people have joined late. So to achieve these goals that we've kind of laid out, in our partnership with UNH, we developed this tiered permit system based on project size. So one thing I really want to emphasize, and I'll probably say a few times, that this system is designed to treat new development and redevelopment projects equally. So in kind of the state standards that are set, you see new development and redevelopment standards, and we've come to the conclusion to kind of reach these goals, recommending that not viewing these projects differently and but viewing them as meeting the same standards is going to be the most beneficial for towns. So as you kind of can see in our table here, we look at minor permits. So this, which includes impervious surfaces between new impervious surfaces between 400 and 1,000 square feet, or disturbances or land disturbances over 500 square feet. As areas, when this kind of permit gets triggered, you would be required to have a 2-inch retention times the new impervious area. For these extensive retrofit permits, that is kind of a third tier that we're adding in. We would be looking at parking lot milling or substantial retrofit. So a retrofit that may be equal to 30% of the property value. And when looking at that, we would hope to see a 2-inch times 20% of the pre-existing impervious area retention, or a 20% reduction in impervious area. And for the major permit, that's where we see this gold standard again, or this climate mitigation standard that we like to call. So when you're looking at new impervious area greater than 1,000 square feet, or land disturbances at greater than 5,000 square feet, we would hope to see a 100-year storm kind of retention, when that can be defined in NOAA Atlas 14. for your specific zip code, times the total impervious area. This structure provides a clear and scalable framework for stormwater management across different project types and sizes. You can move to the next slide. So I want to talk about the importance of a tiered permit system. So many watershed communities like Newton, Arlington, Waltham, Somerville, and Brookline already have implemented a tiered permit system for stormwater management. So this is something we're already seeing in our watershed that is working. These systems are particularly important in the context of increasing urbanization across the watershed. As towns and cities continue to grow, we're seeing a wide range of development types. A one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work in this diverse landscape, so a tiered system addresses that by scaling requirements based on the size and impact of developments, and it allows communities to extend oversight to more types of project. So we're looking really at a way to give municipalities a way to expand their oversight, but also do it in a cost-effective way for themselves. Next slide. So I know Max has touched a little bit on the importance of the 100-year retention system, but I do want to dive deep a little more. So the 100-year storm retention standard has already been adopted in 2 towns, Waltham and Watertown. So it's proven in our watershed to be achievable and effective, and even for a wide range of developments, which we'll hear about a little bit more later. Unlike the current MS4 permit, which primarily targets water quality, this standard goes a step further by integrating climate resilience, and it helps prevent damage and enhancing public safety, especially in areas where infrastructure is aging or undersized. As we experience more frequent and intense storms, retaining more water on site relieves pressure on downstream systems. It also helps reverse the impacts of impervious development and consistently exceeds water quality requirements at all regulatory levels. So this approach doesn't just meet compliance, it also builds in protection for the future. Next slide. And Max touched on this a little bit earlier, but I did want to kind of give more context. So another layer to the importance of this 100-year storm retention standard is that in 2022, the Charles River Watershed Association worked with Weston and Sampson for our Charles River flood model to model future flood scenarios out to 2070 and comparing different approaches to managing development and rainfall. Out of all the options tested, only the 100-year retention standard reduced flooding compared to today's condition. This was especially important around the critical infrastructure that was identified in the model. So this is just kind of another layer that not only is it already being implemented in our towns and the watershed, we're also seeing modeling that kind of is backing up this data this recommendation that we're providing. So with that said, I'm going to hand this over to Alfredo, who is our Rita Barron Fellow, who has actually taken a deep dive into the case studies of the city of Watertown and how they implement this 100-year storm retention. Alfredo, I'll turn to you.
Thank you, Ari.
You can move to the next.
So after going through the why with Ari and Max, I'd like to take a little bit of a deeper dive and showcase the how. So basically, what do these projects actually look like on the ground? And we're very fortunate to be able to look at these real examples of the standard in the watershed. And that's with a special thanks to Watertown, because they keep such a clear and accessible record of current and pending projects, current and pending project reports on their city website. Next slide, please. We compiled super detailed summaries of projects in Watertown that meet the requirements for the submission of a stormwater report in the city. And that doesn't necessarily mean that some of these projects have gone through with the construction yet, but more so, this is just to show what the range of submissions and answers to the retention standard can look like. And here we've selected 3 projects or case studies to present that wider range of stormwater solutions. And the first picture is a conceptual drawing of the 2020 project at 66 Galen Street. The second is an architectural drawing at 6 Churchill Street, as well as 12 Churchill Street. And the third picture is a rendering of the huge redevelopment project that is coming up for the affordable housing units at 8 Quimby Street, also known as Willow Park. Next slide, please. So infiltration systems can range from simple to complex, or even more complex from this slide. And I can go ahead and regurgitate the stormwater report for each of these projects in super painful detail, but we compiled a summary of each highlighting what we believe is most useful to you to start imagining what types of projects can meet the retention standard. So thankfully, I don't have to go through this complex diagram with you, but the big picture for Willow Park is that all developments in general, they work as a system of systems. You don't need to create a huge interconnected network of complex drainage systems to meet this retention standard. And to emphasize this, I want to point out the infiltration system at Site B of the proposed plans for Willow Park. Basically, all of the runoff from the site, pavement, roadways, and landscaping will run into inlets that are on the ground, and they treat the water first of solids and oils, so they go through that pre-treatment phase on the left, and then they're directed into infiltration systems that are under the ground. Roof runoff is treated differently, and it goes straight into the infiltration systems that are underneath the footprint of the building at Site B. So that one doesn't need to go through pre-treatment. And at a glance, the entire project will treat around 55,000 cubic feet of runoff that is attributed to the 100-year storm. And I'm going to point out that the static holding volume of the infiltration system is significantly less than the 100-year storm volume. And that's because the system has super fast infiltrating soils that drain the storage system quickly enough to not need 55,000 static cubic feet of volume. So the infiltration system is able to function efficiently while only statically holding around 40% or 3.5 equivalent inches of rain compared to the 8.9 of the 100-year storm. Next slide, please. And now, not all projects are going to be as big or as expensive as the redevelopment at Willow Park. Some of the smaller projects captured by the retention standard include this residential development at 6 Churchill Street. And this one doesn't have the capacity for huge or complex systems. This project does almost the same thing as Site B in the last slide, but it only utilizes a single infiltration chamber. In this diagram, it's named a recharge tank. And the exact same system is mirrored at 12 Churchill Street. They're the exact same development, just on 2 different lots. And this project still achieves what the larger projects need to achieve, but with a much smaller footprint. The project was required to produce a stormwater report because of the increase in impervious area that it proposed. And again, we see that the 100-year storm volume is higher than the static storage volume because the soils allow for a much smaller storage capacity. Next slide, please. And although most of these projects are only trying to meet the retention standard, it would be really great if projects that have the funds and capacity to go above and beyond would do so. And I think this project at 66 Galen Street does a really good job at showcasing just how sustainable and innovative some of these projects can get. And this is a huge redevelopment of about 5 acres of lots that were transformed into a laboratory / research and development building. And it adds a public park, some retail spaces, as well as a whole new transit infrastructure for the city of Watertown. And this project needed to occur in 2 different phases. So I'm only highlighting the first phase here. The developers were able to achieve LEED Gold certification. And that's a really cool part of this project, utilizing this cistern, which is what the diagram shows here, to irrigate lawns and vegetation on the site using some of the runoff from roofs in phase 2 of the project. So this is a very sophisticated feature that can plan for discharge and holding based on the weather conditions and forecasts. A huge feature here is that the static storage at this phase for the site is only 30% of the volume of runoff from the 100-year storm at the site, or generated from the impervious area. And what's really amazing is that the cistern alone holds 15,000 cubic feet. So some really great things are being done here at this site. Next slide, please. In summary, in 2024, 8 projects required a stormwater report out of 20 total that we found in Watertown. And from those 8 projects, 29, almost 30 pounds of phosphorus were removed from the Charles per year. And 520,000 cubic feet of runoff was infiltrated into the ground using their subsurface infiltration systems, which is about 4 million gallons. And finally, 700,000 square feet of impervious surfaces were treated for the 100-year storm in 2024, which is about 16 acres. And not every town will be able to do or be Watertown in these cases, but this standard is 100% feasible, and it can do a lot of great for the Charles and its watershed with a huge range of implementations and solutions based on a developer's needs.
Thank you so much, Alfredo. Thank you all for kind of listening to us, taking the time of your day. We do have some time left, so I do want to open it up to questions. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We're here to kind of answer. The first question, I had issues connecting, so I don't know if we've already talked about, but why is there all this phosphorus in more urban, suburban areas? So the question is, why is there phosphorus in more urban and suburban areas? And Max, I don't know if you want to answer that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, this is a kind of an interesting thing in the Charles River watershed. There's kind of a assumption that phosphorus pollution is maybe mostly going to come from farmland or fertilizer, but for us, this is an urban watershed, and that's not the main source within the Charles River. The main source is really stormwater runoff. So everything that ends up on the streets ends up on the river. That could be pet waste. That could be someone cleaning out their dumpster and draining it onto the road, or it can be something as benign as just organic material, leaf litter that is on the street. People are driving over it. It kind of gets pulverized. It ends up in the storm system. So, the metaphor I like to use, the thing I try and put across is that we have a 300-acre watershed, or a 300 square mile watershed, and before we developed our storm sewer system, everything that fell on the ground decomposed on the ground. It decomposed in soil. Now that we have the storm drain network, a lot of that organic material is actually decomposing in the river. And as it decomposes, it releases phosphorus that fuels these algal blooms.
Perfect, thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, feel free to come off mute. I think you should be able to do that if you want to just speak up.
The next question about what advocacy is occurring and what incentives are there to push cities that have not yet adopted the tiered permit system to adopt as such. So I can take that question. So part of my job here at CRWA is to actually go out to municipal staff in town and talk to them about kind of what we just heard here and the benefits of it. We also have a very large River Advocate program where we are working with our volunteers to do some more advocacy around stormwater regulations. This topic of this 100-year storm retention standard has been kind of our understanding is this is how one of the most important ways that we can help reach in a swimmable Charles, that's an everyday kind of type of thing, instead of kind of the off days that we see here now. So we're trying to do a lot more advocacy around that, and I'm happy to connect with you, Rachel, a little bit later, because that is some of the work that I specifically work on. And then we have a question from Michelle. What are the main hesitancies, if any, for other towns to adopting the 100-year retention system?
Yeah, well, I'll just kind of add to what Ari's saying and just say this is really new. It's I think Watertown passed kind of the current form of their rule in 2022.
Correct.
And Waltham
2024.
2024.
Yes.
So this is like cutting edge. Towns are doing some really, really bold stuff. I don't think everybody knows about it yet, and I think we're just starting to be in a place where we, Watertown has collected enough information that we can, start to share that, and people can understand how is it working for them. So in terms of hesitancy, I think that's what we'd love to kind of hear from you all, but it's a big lift to do something new, to change your stormwater regulations. It's not an issue that's on the front of everybody's mind. So, what we're really trying to do is highlight the positive, the great reasons for getting into your town's regulations, cleaning them up, and going beyond the state requirements. And I hope that people are going to see that it's feasible and desirable to do so. I can take this question from Jenna. So Jenna Wang is asking, why doesn't roof runoff need pre-treatment? Are there less contaminants in this runoff? This is a great question. I think I like to answer this question kind of a more simple way, which is that, what we're trying to do is something that works on a watershed scale. So we're not really distinguishing so clearly between, okay, what's roof runoff versus sidewalk runoff versus road runoff, but more looking, the way these studies were set up was to look at what's the relationship between impervious cover and water quality in the Charles River. So pre-treatment is important when there's a lot of sediment or potentially a lot of trash in stormwater. And pre-treatment, as Alfredo kind of showed in his slides, is often a component of stormwater infiltration systems. You want to have something before the infiltration system where that, those heavier materials can build up, a plastic bag, a bottle cap, and you can clean that out easily without it clogging the infiltration system.
Thank you, Max. In the next question from Julia, in the 66 Galen Street example, what do they want to do with the stored water if they want to deplete it ahead of the storm?
Yeah, so for the way that they describe the cistern and how it works is that it could either be infiltrated into the ground. So the way that the cistern worked was that it treats roof runoff from phase 2 of the project. And phase 2 also has subsurface infiltration systems. So the roof runoff will first go into the cistern, and then it can be used for irrigation, which is its primary use, to irrigate lawns, vegetation, etc. But if for some reason they need to deplete the water that they're holding in that moment, they can send it to the infiltration systems in phase 2 of the project, or just irrigate beforehand, and that'll reduce the amount of water that is in there, and they can prescribe these reductions ahead of storm events.
I'll just repeat that one because it's so complicated what Alfredo just said. Yeah, basically they have a cistern and they can either reuse that water for irrigation or they can send it to an infiltration system that soaks it into the ground.
The next question we got from Priscilla is, how were these towns able to convince the public that the 100-year flood retention system was needed? What is the cost difference? Was that used in the education convincing to get these rules passed? I can speak to this a little bit. I want to preface this that I don't have much context, especially specifically on Waltham. I know that the city of Watertown did put together a kind of stormwater working group to kind of put this stuff together, and there was a lot of education. I don't believe they specifically use the cost difference in the education around getting this passed, but as this is such a newer idea that's been put out, we do see kind of a different unique approach to kind of getting these stuff passed. I don't know, Max, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, and if there's anyone from Watertown or Waltham who wants to speak up and answer this, that would be appreciated as well. But what I've heard is that when Watertown was looking at a couple different standards, they were thinking about the 25-year storm, the 10-year storm, and as they kind of ran the numbers, what they saw was that dealing with the 100-year storm was not going to be substantially more expensive than dealing with the 25-year storm.
Great, thank you, Max. I believe we have time for about one more question. I'm not sure if anyone has feel free to unmute, feel free to put it in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. If we don't have any more questions, I'll let you guys go a little early. I just want to say thank you again for joining us. As I said earlier, my name is Arna Proya. You will have get a follow-up email with me that has the slides, the recording, our matrix, and also this narrative that we've put together, kind of condensing down the new recommendations that we recommend for stormwater regulations. And if there's any way I can be of help to any municipal staff or elected officials, please feel free to reach out to me as well. And for our residents, if you want to get involved in kind of advocating for these stormwater regulations, you can also reach out to me and I will put you in contact with the right people. So thank you again for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.